I thought it would be interesting to talk about Brexit because on many occasions when I'm in different places around the world, and certainly here at USC and certainly talking to Jack, there's a lot of discussion about what's going on, what's taking place. People aren't at all clear what's happening. And so I felt it might be helpful to try and set it out. I chose the title, the UK's Brexit Psychodrama, because it does seem to me that it's a big psychological question in the world of identity politics. Where does Britain stand? How does history relate to it? What are the actual circumstances where we are? And then where would it all lead? Because obviously there's a great deal of uncertainty, and Jack referred to some of the points there about where it is all going to end and what's going to take place. And I thought where I'd kick off is go right back to the history after 1945. And this really builds on a lecture I gave here in this room about a year ago about what I see as the collapse of the post-war settlement. Essentially, after 1945, the terrible disasters of the economic depression, of the World War, the deaths of millions of people because of the things that had arisen, led the countries of that time to come together and say, how could we create a world where these kind of circumstances didn't recur again? I think there were three dimensions to this settlement that was gradually forged over a 5 or 7 year period. Firstly, Keynesian economics, economic policies and strategies to try and ensure you didn't have mass unemployment in the way that had been so damaging for so many countries before the Second World War. Secondly, to have a set of approaches to welfare, health and so on, to ensure that no individual would slip into such levels of poverty that they couldn't survive in those circumstances. And thirdly, to build a range of international organisations which would try and ensure that you didn't get the misunderstandings leading to conflicts, which were, of course, the immediate proximate cause of the Second World War. The most important of those, of course, being the United Nations, but a whole range of other institutions formed by the United Nations, and then NATO, European Union, all examples of institutions around that same area. If you go back to the European Union, it was specifically and consciously created to try and stop the Franco-German antagonism, which had ripped the continent of Europe apart in 1870, 1914, 1939, and to set up institutions to try and ensure that would be the case. So that was the post-war settlement. I would say it was broadly successful. It led to prosperity in a wide range of different areas, but it gave rise also to globalization, the increasingly global nature of our world economy. And as globalization began to get going, I think that led from about the year 2000 into a series of circumstances where chunks of the world got left behind from this advance of globalization. The symbol I always mention here in the States is the Rust Belt. What happened to the economies in the Rust Belt and how they went in my country, in the UK, in the northeast of England, what happened to the coal industry, the shipbuilding industry, the steel industry, what replaced those when they had gone. In northern France, the French coal field as the mines closed down, and so on. And the globalization that took place did bring prosperity, it did spread prosperity, but it left significant chunks of the population feeling left out of this process that took place. And I think that gave rise across the world to a series of demands for people speaking on behalf of those people. I would say that was the origin of the Tea Party movement here in the United States, and then that led to Donald Trump's presidential election and successful presidential election here, mobilizing that same sense of feeling, the sense that you can't trust those kind of strategy things, you can't trust the international organizations, we need to take back control for ourselves in order to be able to achieve those things. It wasn't something just in the US. Here in Britain, we had the Brexit strategy, UKIP, Nigel Farage, a set of people like that. In France, the Front National, Marine Le Pen, almost winning the presidency over that period. In Germany, the rise of the AfD, not strong enough to really challenge the existing state of quo, but even today raising challenges for the stable post-war situation that had been achieved. So the story I'm telling is of a settlement post-1945, which has been crumbling 70 to 75 years later afterwards, leading to political crisis now. The UK had a particular dimension to this situation, which was existing quite widely across the world, what I think of as the national story. Still in schools in many parts of Britain, World War II is still a dominant theme. And in the time World War II, there was Britain, up with Roosevelt in America, up with Stalin in Russia. We were one of the top three running the world. We were plucky little Britain who stood alone against Nazism and then finally were able to triumph. And this kind of view, I won't call it a myth because it's not entirely a myth, is a part of the story of people's thinking. We were a great power. We joined the European Union about 20 years after the European Union was formed. We didn't want to be part of those Europeans. We wasn't part of what we were about. We were Britain. We could do it alone. Thank you very much. We didn't need those kind of approaches. And that dimension has gone right through our national politics into this period. I take the example in 2005, 14 years ago, of the Conservative leadership election between David Cameron, who eventually won the Conservative leadership and then became Prime Minister, and David Davis, who became Theresa May's exiting the European Union minister. David Cameron won that election, and the way he did so, apart from his personal characteristics, was that he said he'd take the Conservative Party out of the alliance in Europe with the other Conservative parties in the European Union, the so-called EPP. We stand alone, we're not with all those other people. And that was enough to get him elected leader of the Conservative Party in 2005 and then Prime Minister. But as this was all taking place, a whole set of, and this is the psychodrama dimension, a whole set of other aspects started growing up. We had the UK Independence Party, which was about taking Britain out of the European Union, building big bodies of support in our European elections, threatening both the Conservatives and Labour Party, but more the Conservative Party in that process, calling for Brexit, saying we stand alone, we don't want to be part of any of that process, led by a man called Nigel Farage, who tried a number of times to become a British Member of Parliament, never succeeded. Ironically, became a European member, a member of the European Parliament, but not of the British Parliament. And all kinds of arguments going on, but his personality coming through consistently in that. And this put pressure on the Conservative Party because they worried, with justification, that if they didn't succeed in dealing with this worry about Europe, the rest of it, then the danger was that they would lose support to the UKIP party firstly, then the Brexit party on their right. So maybe a quarter, a third, a half even of their vote in particular parliamentary seats would disappear. So they edged over towards saying, we the Conservatives have to address these questions. And so they had generally anti-European manifestos, and they finally had the manifesto in their election of 2015 that said we will have a referendum to take Britain in or out of the European Union. They were exposed at the end of the day, actually. There'd been an election, there'd been a coalition before 2015 between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. After the 2015 election, which the Conservatives were expected to lose, they did better than expected and were able to govern alone. And so they had to implement their manifesto. They had actually hoped that the Liberals would still be there in coalition and they would not have allowed it. And so they put it in as an election pledge, hoping not to have to deal with it. And so by that process, we got to the state of affairs of having the referendum in 2016 that took place. The referendum took place on the 23rd of June 2016. It was an unexpected result. Everybody expected the vote to be to stay in the European Union by anything up to 60-40. Some thought even at the level of 2/3. And it was unprepared. There were no preparations made for the possibility of a vote going through that the UK would leave the European Union. I would say each of these items, as I'll go through, are themselves potential subjects for very substantial conversations that we can have. But I would say the campaign itself was extremely badly run, very complacent, didn't address the real concerns that people had. And of course, going back to what I said at the beginning, like all referendums, the people setting out the referendum can say this is a referendum about a particular subject, in or out of the European Union. But for the voters, they don't have to vote on that basis at all. They can vote on whatever basis they like, to give the Prime Minister David Cameron a bloody nose, to express their outrage with the state of the world in which they live. And this, by the way, is the story of all referendums, not just this referendum. If you have a referendum, people have many different motivations in the way that they vote in the referendum. The biggest usually being to get the bastards out, whoever the bastards are, and you take that opportunity when you don't otherwise have that opportunity to vote in that way. And so I don't think it's right to regard the referendum simply as a judgment on whether the UK should or shouldn't be in the European Union. That was obviously the major factor, but it's also a comment on all those other things about post-globalisation, immigration, a whole range of issues that I was mentioning earlier on. So what was the result? 52-48. 52% in favour of leaving, 48% in favour of remaining. A very tight vote, very difficult to deliver, very difficult to carry through. The referendum didn't say what kind of Brexit it should be, whether we should come out of the economic institutions as well as the political institutions, whether we should leave the fisheries policy as well as the agricultural policy, whatever. None of these complexities were on the ballot paper. It was just a yes or no, a leave, remain vote. And there were a whole set of questions about did we stay in the economic institutions of the European Union, the customs union, the single market being the two core ones of those. How did we deal with immigration? Because one of the main arguments, and as I'll say in a second, Theresa May, the new Prime Minister, believed this very strongly, that led people to leave was a desire to control, in some sense, immigration from the rest of the European Union, to be able to stop Romanians or Greeks or Portuguese people being able to come and work in Britain. That was thought to be one of the big factors in the whole process. And just as you had here with Donald Trump as immigration an issue, the wall and all the rest of it, that was a fear which is justified or not. I'm not commenting on the substance of it, which motivated people to vote in many of these areas. But of course, the consequence of having a referendum and the decision to leave was there was then a choice, because that was a decision to have two entities, the European Union there and the United Kingdom there. And between these two entities, there would be different rules, economic rules, political rules, customs rules, VAT rules, or whatever. And that meant you had to have a border between these two entities, the UK and the European Union, if the UK was no longer to be a part of the European Union. And that fact, which is a consequence of having a border, has been the dominant factor of the problems of implementing the European Union right through the whole process. There are in fact three borders that the UK has with the rest of the European Union. One is in Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, where the UK has what are called sovereign military bases, which are still there and have been an important part of our military structure, and they're parts of the UK, and there is a border between them and Cyprus, which is in the European Union. It's not a major political issue on the border there. There are some issues, not much trade, not much people movement, not very substantial. The second one is Gibraltar, which is a bit more complicated. Going back to the Treaty of Utrecht, in I think the 16th century, the Gibraltar is British territory right down at the end of the Mediterranean. It's been a constant source of claims by the Spanish government to say give Gibraltar back to Spain, and it's been a central problem that has gone on. The border there is sometimes an issue. The Spanish have from time to time closed the border. Again, there is substantial trade in Gibraltar. I doubt any of you have actually visited Gibraltar. I can say to you, if you ever do go there, it is an extraordinarily strange place to go to. A bit of 1950s England in the middle of modern Spain. It's an extraordinary place to visit, and it was a military base there. So Gibraltar is also a border issue, but not really a big issue. Northern Ireland is a mega border issue, when it's the most substantial of these. Why is it a mega issue? Until 100 years ago or so, until 1921, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. It sent members of Parliament to the United Kingdom, it was governed by the United Kingdom, and there was a very long struggle against what was seen as colonial rule by Britain over Ireland, often involving sharp and difficult military conflict, civil war and so on. And so in 1921, Ireland was partitioned. So you have Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland with a border there. Around that border, there were substantial military conflicts of a whole variety of different kinds. Terrorism, through the whole of my youth, was a significant factor in Ireland. And then there was the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which was concluded by Tony Blair as Prime Minister, but had been prepared by John Major, the previous British Prime Minister, which was a settlement to say that we did not, we would end this conflict that had been going on and been so destructive for so long time. Very important landmark agreement, the so-called Good Friday Agreement, and it meant that the border was abolished. The reason why the border could be abolished was that both Britain and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, were members of the European Union. So they were in the same economic arrangements, the same tax arrangements, and same customs arrangements, and so on. And so you didn't need the border. The immediate consequence of going back to the fact you did have to have a border is what do you do in Northern Ireland, on the Northern Ireland-Southern Ireland border? With many fears, one can argue how justified or not, that if you put a border back in some form or another, then the military conflict could again begin to recur between the Unionists and the Nationalists in Ireland, and that was seen, rightly in my opinion, as something to be very worried about. I thought it would just be illuminating to mention that the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, last week said there were five, from his point of view, 5 serious options that would deal with the border. And I'll just quickly run through his 5 options because it illustrates the kind of problem which was not confronted by the British government throughout the whole of this process. Option 1 was for the UK to stay in the European Union. The problem simply wouldn't exist if that was the case, but the referendum said against that. Option 2 is a united Ireland, i.e. put the north of Ireland in the whole of the island of Ireland. That is massively controversial. It is the possibility of it is allowed by the Good Friday Agreement, where it's possible to have a referendum if it's likely that the majority of the people in Northern Ireland would vote to become part of the south of Ireland. Not very likely, though in fact this whole process is pushing people more towards doing that. And then he said with tongue-in-cheek, the third one, GB Ireland, going back to 100 years ago and having one country, which is what's now Great Britain and Ireland all together. But he said the Irish government wouldn't be able to accept that. The fourth option, single market and customs union, is to say that Northern Ireland stayed in the economic institutions of the European Union, the single market and the customs union. And if you did that, then you can get to a state of affairs where you don't need the border in Ireland because they're both in the same economic institutions. And finally, the so-called backstop, which has beset this debate, which is what Theresa May's deal had, which included that they basically stay in the economic institutions, but would, if some other solution to the border problem were found, then it was dealt with in this way. I've gone through the rather complicated consequences of the referendum decision because they dominated the way in which things went from there on. David Cameron saw all these problems, and so his first act within 24 hours of losing the referendum was to resign as Prime Minister and leave and say, OK, you've decided that, you lot get on and deal with it. And after a rather desultory process, Theresa May became the new British Prime Minister. And she was selected by the Conservative Party because she was seen as a safe pair of hands to try and deal with these problems. She herself is a decent woman, I know her well. I don't think she's understood fully what the issues and problems were, but she was well respected in the country as doing her best to try and operate in those circumstances. But she made a number of core strategic errors. First, in October 2016, the referendum, remember, was in June 2016, at the Conservative Party conference, she set out her speech putting her red lines down. And this was a major strategic choice. She could have said it was a 52-48 vote, it was very tight, I'm going to try and bring the country together to see if we can find a solution to these problems. That probably would have meant we stayed in the economic institutions, the single market and the customs union, but left the political institutions, i.e. we wouldn't be members of the Council of Ministers, we wouldn't have a commissioner, we wouldn't be in the European Parliament, but we'd stay in the economic institutions. That was a possibility. It's roughly what Norway does today. It has, from her point of view, a very big disadvantage, and from others' point of view also a big disadvantage, different one. The big disadvantage is that if you stay in the single market, the rules of the European Union are that you have to allow freedom of movement of labour. That means immigration from the rest of the EU to the UK without any checks at the border continues. And in those circumstances, Theresa May's view was that the core mandate from that referendum decision had been to stop immigration from the EU, and therefore she was of the view that you couldn't stay in the economic institutions. For the rest of us, there is a problem about staying in the economic institutions and not in the political institutions, and that takes me back to the great power position right at the beginning. It means that people who are not accountable to or part of the British government set the economic rules of trade for the whole UK economy. They decide, without any British Parliament having any rights in the matter, without any input from British ministers, what the rules will be of that situation. And of course many people are outraged by that idea, the idea we'd have no say. If you're in the EU, you have a say because you contribute to the discussions, but if you're out of the EU and you accept the deal, then that's the position that you have to accept, and that's what Norway does, for example. But that's why I talk about the psychodrama. For Britain, unlike Norway, we couldn't be like that, of having those rules set by someone else in a different kind of way. But she took that decision. In truth, if she decided not to go down that line, she'd have had massive divisions within the Conservative Party, and she wasn't ready to go down that path. But it meant that she said no discussion with Labour, no discussion across the chamber with other people about where we go, no attempt to get some agreed position. And I think that was a major strategic error. It forced her to work her way through on that basis. The second strategic error was on the 29th of March 2017. She sent the letter to the European Union saying formally, the referendum having happened, we now want to leave the European Union. It's called an Article 50 letter because it's a letter under Article 50 of the formal treaty process. And that says any country can send one saying we want to leave the European Union, and it then sets out a timetable 2 years after that letter is sent, during which there is a negotiation about the terms of the departure and what happens. That process takes place. Why it was a major strategic error, and I think most people in Britain would say now that's absolutely clear, is she sent the letter before being clear, even within her cabinet, even within her party, and certainly across the country, what her basic position was for what she wanted as the future position. So she started a negotiation process with a defined end without being clear what she wanted. She could have delayed sending the Article 50 letter until she knew what the strategy was. She could have got agreement to the strategy. She could have tried to get all party agreement if that's what she wanted, but even if she didn't, all Conservative Party agreement, all cabinet agreement, but she didn't. So she set the process running on a basis of controversy and uncertainty about what the UK's desired outcome was. And I think that was a core strategic error at that time. You'll find that date coming round again in a slide. 2 days later, she called a general election. She called a general election because she wanted to change her position in relation to Parliament, and I'll just describe how this is. This was the election in 2015. We have 650 members of Parliament in Britain, so you need 325 in order to be able to get your stuff through. The 2015 election, which David Cameron led them into, the Tories had 330 seats, so there were 5 seats over the margin of 325. So he could get his business through, they could get their process through, whatever the opposition party said, if her party held together. But she thought, quite rightly really, that wasn't much of a majority. It was a majority of twice 5, 10 to get her stuff through. And she knew she had plenty of Conservatives who were opposed to what she's doing. So she thought, let's go for a general election and get a better position in the new Parliament. The opinion polling all said that she would get a better position in the Parliament. She said she wouldn't have an alternative election, but she went on a romantic walk with her husband in North Wales, the mountains of Snowdonia, and she came back from her romantic walk, and I would warn all of you to avoid romantic walks in the future. And she did this romantic walk, and she came back to begin having an election. So we had an election. She conducted the campaign very poorly and very badly. And essentially, because she did it as trust me to lead these negotiations, the people said, well, No. And that's what happened. And that's what happens if you do this in these kind of ways. It's a lesson for the future as well. So the election 2017, she went down to 317. Now, the more numerative unit, and I know the Price School is a highly numerate part of USC, will detect that 317 is less than 325. And so she didn't have enough to take her through to govern what she did. So she had to form an alliance or coalition. Otherwise, she'd have to resign. And she decided to make a coalition with the Democratic Unionist Party. That 317 plus 10, takes you just over the 325 mark, so she could then form a government. Theoretically, she might have made agreements with other parties, but all of them were difficult in various reasons. The big one would have been a grand coalition with Labour, which is very unusual in British politics. It happened during the Second World War. It does happen in other European countries. Angela Merkel, for example, it's not always recognised, governs as part of a grand coalition with the SPD, the Labour Party in Germany. The European Parliament itself runs on a grand coalition basis. In France, they often had what was called cohabitation between the different parties to try and deal with situations. But it's not part of our culture. That wasn't going to happen. Making a deal with the nationalists, most of whom are Scottish nationalists, would have meant giving them a further referendum and Scottish independence. She wasn't going to do that. Making a deal with the Liberals, which had been the story up to 2015, there wasn't a possible basis for agreement. So she ended up with the DUP. Now, the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, is the majority party in Northern Ireland. It represents the nationalists in Northern Ireland, i.e. those people who want under no circumstances to have any dealings with the south of Ireland. It's a very extreme party, and they would not tolerate anything which was a deal which would weaken the relationship between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And that was a constant factor that she had to deal with the whole time, and is now today a factor for Boris Johnson to deal with when he's dealing with the situation too. So the general election strategy didn't succeed. When she got to the general election on the 8th of June, and it took place, she'd taken away even her majority that she had in Parliament to help her take this stuff through. And the parliamentary arithmetic was as I've described, and she had to make the deal with the DUP. So that was a further absolutely central strategic error. Number one, to take the overall strategy she did. Number two, to send the letter before she decided what she was going to do. Number three, to call the general election, then of course to lose it. There's a lot of room for discussions, I say, in all these things, why she lost the election, why it went wrong, but she did. I'll come back to this slide a bit later on to see where we've got to now. Just so as you know, well, I'll tell you that the end line before we've got there. Boris Johnson's leadership has today brought the Tories down from 317 to 288 on this date today. So he's in a much worse position even than Theresa May was in the UK Parliament. We'll come back to that in a second. So after this, this was all going on in the general election, but the EU then responded to the Article 50 letter about a month after it was sent, the 29th of April 2017, and it had a number of things that it said that it was going to seek agreement on, but there were three which stood out above all others. One, money; two, citizens' rights; three, the border in Ireland. And they succeeded, I said here clear and united, they succeeded throughout the whole process in keeping all 27 EU countries basically in the same place. There were many people in Britain who thought it'll be a doddle, we'll divide up Germany and France, we'll get the German car manufacturers to oppose the French champagne manufacturers or whatever, and there would be divisions on the EU side and we can get our stuff through as the UK. This was always an illusion in my view, and it's been a triumph of EU diplomacy to hold to their positions. And they said, we want to sort out these three things and then we can make the agreement, sign all the treaty, and there we are, that's the deal. The first was money. How much did the UK owe the EU? Because there'd been a whole set of commitments that the UK had entered into, and the EU wanted its money. The final agreement, and it was broadly agreed, is about £39 billion, which is not an enormous amount of money, but it's not trivial either. It doesn't quite buy you a place at USC, but it's getting up there in terms of what you have to do. That has been a source of controversy throughout the whole process, because the anti-Europeans, the anti-EU people in the Tory party say we're not going to give them any money, we should play hardball, say no money, and that's the state of affairs. Second, citizens' rights. Quite important, not too difficult to resolve, because there are millions of EU citizens living in the UK. After the agreement, what are their legal rights, whether you're talking about their political rights, their economic rights, rights to use the health service, right to get pensions, welfare state. Equally, millions of UK citizens living in the EU, many of them retired in Spain and so on. What are their rights going to be? There needs to be an agreement to deal with that. And broadly speaking, there has been an agreement to deal with that, though it's not yet signed. None of this agreement is signed yet. There is as yet no agreement. The tough one was the border in Ireland, because the EU, all 27 countries, said we cannot tolerate a position where we're going to have a border in Ireland that will possibly bring back that conflict in Ireland. And of course, particularly strong in that was the Irish government, who didn't want that in their situation. They wanted the economic situations of the businesses in Ireland and so on, agriculture, to work together well. And so there's been a negotiation taking place about these three issues between the EU and the UK government. And it was designed to come to an agreement which would take place 2 years after that Article 50 letter was sent, i.e. March 2019. The agreement, when agreed, had to be agreed by the UK government, by the European Commission and Council of Ministers, by the UK Parliament, and by the European Parliament. And that the theory was that would all be carried through and agreed. Lots of arguments about what the motivations were in all this. The EU had a clear motivation that they didn't want to see countries being able to leave the EU that easily, so they were going to play relative hardball. But that process has then gone on for about 2 years, up till March. What I should perhaps have been more careful with my language. No border infrastructure in Northern Ireland. The legal border would still be in Northern Ireland, but there wouldn't be any enforcement of the border in sense of border posts, border checks, all that kind of thing in the border, because those border posts and border checks had all been the places where terrorist action had taken place prior to the Good Friday Agreement. They were the places that were blown up by the Irish nationalists, where soldiers were killed at those borders and so on. And so there's been a lot of talk about, quote, technological solutions, other solutions which might obviate the need for an infrastructure there. Indeed, Boris Johnson's most recent set of proposals are designed to try and achieve that, but they were immediately vetoed by the Irish government just about a month ago.
They want to have a market for this.
Completely. And both the economic welfare of Northern Ireland and of the island of Ireland, Southern Ireland, are dependent on a strong market existing between North and South Ireland. And I should perhaps have mentioned, Northern Ireland itself voted quite decisively to stay in the European Union. They knew that their interests were served by that process. The DUP was against, but they're not representing the country. And I'll just divert for a second onto the messy politics of Northern Ireland. You've got 10 DUP MPs, so the nationalist community. You've got 7 of these others, this SF, Sinn Féin. They're the Irish independents. But they, as a matter of, I hate to say principle because I've got no time for them, but they won't take their seats in the British Parliament because they don't recognise the hegemony of the Queen, and they're not ready to do it. They will take seats in the Irish Parliament when they're elected to it, but not to the British Parliament. And actually, those 7 would have made quite a difference in all the arithmetic that's happening therefore. And those 16 plus 1, who's one of these independents, a woman called Lady Sylvia Herman, who's a fantastic woman, who was the wife of the Chief Constable in Northern Ireland many years ago. She's a unionist, but a moderate unionist. Those were the people. And it's gradually gone to the extremes in Northern Ireland. When you come to this election, the others are a larger number, because Sinn Féin in that election was only 4, but you also had 3 SDLP, who were the moderate nationalists, and 2 Ulster Unionists, who were the moderate unionists in Northern Ireland elected. But those moderate parties were wiped out in the 2017 election. The Irish electorate went to the extremes, the DUP and Sinn Féin. It's a complication in the whole situation. So those are the 3 issues that have been talked about. So what happened to Theresa May's leadership after that general election? And really it's a story of steady decline. So you had the negotiations taking place, ups and downs, lots of stories, lots of drama. The DUP always there saying you're not going to change our fundamental bottom lines. And a whole string of Tory rebellions and challenges, because the Tory party has got 30 to 40 in it who absolutely allied with the DUP on all of these questions, and they wouldn't support the Prime Minister if she was trying to get the deal. And there was many challenges to her leadership. There was an effort to get her slung out before this process, which failed. But it culminated in 3 parliamentary defeats at the beginning of this year. And again, that date I mentioned earlier is significant. 29th of March, the letter went. 29th of March 2019 is when the whole process ended. And we had these 3 votes. The first one on 15th of January, which she lost by 230 votes. I apologise for using the UK version of date and month, by the way. I should have switched them for here. She lost by 230 votes, the biggest ever defeat of a British Prime Minister ever in British political history, and extraordinary in those figures. Got it down by the 12th of March to 149, and then the 29th of March, a day or 2 before was the final date, she got it down to 48. And her theory was, by saying to people, you've got a deal, you've got a deal, you've got a deal, that people would cave in on their positions. But it didn't happen, and there was piles of speculation going on about this the whole time. And so there we were on 31st of March, scheduled to leave the European Union on the agreement that had taken place. But Theresa May had to go back to the European Union and say, we can't leave, can we have an extension? And any extension has to be agreed by unanimity by the EU member countries so that we don't leave on 31st of March. And that was agreed by the European Council with a lot of flurrying about. Emmanuel Macron said, I don't agree, I don't really want to do it, but they all agreed at the end. And that 31st of March was shifted forward to 31st of October, so 2 weeks from now is the next deadline in the whole process. The final moment of leaving, 31st of March 2019, was extended by agreement to 31st October. Then we would have left the European Union. And
really, it's a way to extend negotiations.
Yes, but the question was quite real then. It's very real now, as I'll come to when we get to what's going on now, as we get towards October 31st. But I emphasise that it's got to be unanimity. Now, I said earlier that the EU had stayed very solid in all this throughout the process. They worked together, surprisingly successfully, many would say, but it did do that, and it did that on that question too. Because, I mean, it's important to say, for the rest of the European Union, UK crashing out of the EU is also very bad news. It's pretty bad. It's really bad news for the UK, but it's pretty bad news for everybody else too, and they want to avoid it. On the other hand, they don't want a situation where they're just hanging on forever and the matter's unresolved, taking all of their energies from the other big issues the EU has to try and deal with over time. So the pressure on her built up very substantially in the Tory party, and she had to resign as Tory leader, which she did on the 7th of June after the extension had happened. There was then a Conservative leadership election, and on the 24th of July, she resigned as Prime Minister. Arrive Boris Johnson, 24th of July, becomes Prime Minister. No resolution to the situation, accelerated decline. We're going to leave the European Union, do or die, he said on 31st of October. And that was his election manifesto in the very small Conservative Party electorate who were choosing who would be the Conservative leader and therefore the Prime Minister. Do or die. And that was the basis upon which he went forward. And then your question then comes straight in, because he was quite clear, even if there's no deal, we'll leave then without a deal. And there's been a massive process going on. What happens if there's a no-deal departure from the European Union? There's lots of basics, like the planes stop flying because there's no agreement on air safety requirements, pharmaceutical drugs don't arrive, the trade systems all crop up, get mugged up because you can't cross the borders and so on. Everybody thinks that if there is a no-deal departure, the economic consequences are very, very major. Worst for the UK, second worst for Ireland, very bad even for Germany and France. So nobody wants that. But Boris Johnson said, I don't care, I'm going to go for no deal in the belief that I can bully the European Union to agree some deal of some kind. So he became Prime Minister 24th of July, worth noticing the date because that immediately followed by August when Parliament wasn't sitting. So there was an activity. He didn't do anything directly except getting his staff to threaten in a lot of media stuff that he would get rid of Parliament altogether, so-called prorogue it, during the period up to 31st October, and call a general election if he could, so that the general election took us past the 31st October. So the current statute in Britain, which is that we leave on the 31st of October, couldn't be amended by anybody, so therefore it would happen. But these really alarmed a lot of people, and of course a lot of Conservatives. So the majority in Parliament, and going back to my little, if you add up all these, that lot, it's well ahead of the 298 of the Conservatives and DUP. So if these people could work together, they had a capacity to pass the laws that were necessary in spite of the position of Boris Johnson and the Conservative leadership. Big question for this lot, can they work together? They're a very disparate group of politicians, different views, different circumstances. But they did work together. For the 3rd of September, they passed a bill now called the Benn Bill, after a guy called Hilary Benn, MP for Leeds, whose father was Tony Benn, very well known in Labour politics in Britain many years ago. And the purpose of the Benn Bill was to say, under no circumstances can we leave with no deal. No deal is so bad, so serious, that we, the UK Parliament, say there will be no circumstances in which we leave. And it required that if there had not been a deal or agreement by the 19th of October, that's next week, that would be the final date, and then they would require the Prime Minister to ask for a further extension from the EU. And they would require that further extension to be to the 31st of January 2020. That doesn't mean that if the British government makes that request, that the EU would agree it. And that remains still an open and important question. But it meant that the idea was to try and avoid the possibility that there would be a no-deal departure. Piles of speculation about this. Would Boris Johnson obey the law? I mean, Prime Ministers are supposed to obey the law. If would he obey the law? Would he send that letter if that's what happens at that time? He said he wouldn't answer the question and would refuse to say he would do it. Law officers of the government said that they'd resign if he didn't do it. A whole set of issues of that type started becoming very salient. In political terms, 21 Conservatives voted against the three-line whip for this Benn Bill to say if the no-deal situation, we shouldn't have it. Boris Johnson then shocked everybody by immediately sacking them from the Tory party. So they're no longer members of the Tory party. What that means, in a general election, they can't run as Conservatives, they can only run as independents. Many people were shocked by this. Ken Clarke, for example, been the Father of the House there for very many years, Chancellor of the Exchequer many times. Philip Hammond, Tory, Theresa May's Chancellor of the Exchequer, all sacked from the Tory party with the stroke of a pen that day. Winston Churchill's grandson, sacked from the Tory party. Which was an extraordinary thought in the psychodrama going back to beforehand. And that's why, going back to there, you've got such a large number of independents. The independents have gone up from 1 to 40. 21 of those are the Tories I've just talked about, but there's also been a steady dribble throughout the period of people leaving the Tory party, becoming independent. The Lib Dems have crept up from 2017, 12 to 19, by some Labour people leaving and joining the Lib Dems, some Tories leaving and joining the Lib Dems. The woman who represents the parliamentary constituency right next to where I live in Cambridge has left the Tories and is now going to run for the Lib Dems. So this process of change it has been churning along in a very significant way. And the politics of it has been very dramatic, actually. So the timetable that we're in is that the Benn Bill was passed. The European Council is next weekend on the 17th, 18th, and that is where the European Council is supposed to agree or not agree, whatever happens at that point. There's a lot of theatre going on about that at the moment. Some people saying Boris Johnson is going to refuse to meet them if they won't agree with what he wants, etc., and nobody knows what the outcome will be. As Jack said in his introduction, that's why we've got a parliamentary debate on that day, the 19th, which is a Saturday, where Parliament will be recalled to think what Parliament will do the day after the European Council, according to whatever the course of events has been. 31st, as I say, is the day that we're currently scheduled to leave the EU. The new Benn Bill deadline is 31st of January. Some people are now talking that the European Union won't accept 31st of January, but will do it in 30th of June 2020, i.e. a long extension to allow general election, allow a referendum or whatever. But there's a big degree of uncertainty about this. But that Johnson's leadership has actually led to a situation where the crisis that was quite bad already has been massively accelerated, and his bluster doesn't work. I'll just say one thing before coming back to Labour. Constitutional issues, all of this led to a whole set of different territory, which for Britain's unusual. We haven't got a written constitution, as you do. When Theresa May resigned, it wasn't absolutely clear that the Queen would ask the leader of the Conservative Party to form a government, Boris Johnson, because he didn't have a majority in Parliament, and he's lost a whole string of votes on all kinds of things. But she did. There was then a decision to prorogue Parliament, which means basically to close it down, that is done on powers by the Queen. And there was a challenge to the legality of that prorogation, which succeeded. The Supreme Court, which is a relatively new intervention in British life, here it was only established in 1999, I think, decided with a unanimous decision, very strong worded judgments, that the Prime Minister had behaved completely unconstitutionally in proroguing Parliament, because it was widely believed that he was proroguing Parliament to stop Parliament being able to do things like pass the Benn Bill and deal with those situations. That time he was trying to disenfranchise Parliament. I mentioned one of the other issues on rule of law, a whole set of issues about whether the government would actually obey the law when things came along. There's a guy who works for Boris Johnson called Dominic Cummings, who was the mastermind behind the Leave campaign in the referendum, who he's employed as his number one advisor in 10 Downing Street. And he's been the guy putting out all kinds of briefings about things and leading to a lot of division. And then the final thing just to say is in 2011, when there was a Tory Liberal coalition, one of the conditions of the coalition to get a majority at that time was that the prerogative of the Prime Minister to call a general election when they wanted to was removed, and the Fixed Term Parliament Act was passed, and there's a set of more complicated rules about who can call a general election, and Parliament essentially has to call it. And I'll come back to that when we talk about options at the moment. Now, where was Labour on all of this? I say this with sorrow as a former Labour cabinet minister and a person active within Labour. I've characterised it as incoherence and division. One of the things I should have said right at the very beginning, talking about the post-45 settlement, is I think populism, extremism and so on hasn't only been a right-wing phenomenon, it's also been a left-wing phenomenon as people have rejected the centre parties. I would say the manifestation here is the support for Bernie Sanders. In countries like Greece, it was the election of a government there from an extreme left position. In Labour's case, it was the election to the leadership of Labour of Jeremy Corbyn, who is the leader of the Labour Party. He's anti-staying in the EU, unlike almost the whole of the Labour Party. He doesn't think we should be in the EU. He says the EU is a capitalist plot, and that's the state of affairs, and we shouldn't be any part of it. A much more nasty thing has developed of a whole sense of anti-Semitism within Labour, really coming from positions flowing from Palestine and Israel and the arguments around that. And that has been a very nasty process which has led large numbers of people to distance themselves, let's put it mildly, from Jeremy Corbyn. There's a whole set of issues and it's been very divisive. And on top of that, his total uselessness in doing anything effectively. So Labour has not been in a strong position as an opposition to play a substantial role in this process that I've described. Tom Watson, who's more reasonable, who's the deputy leader, Corbyn made a massive effort to get rid of him at the Labour Party conference 2 weeks ago, unsuccessfully. I was down in the conference, I spoke to Corbyn and some of his colleagues, and his central power base is breaking up. Two of these people, Andrew Fisher, Carrie Murphy, have resigned from his immediate operation team. Carrie Murphy's just been sacked to go somewhere else. And the senior people, MacDonald, the Shadow Chancellor, Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, are distancing themselves from Corbyn. So the story of Labour in this is it hasn't made any positive contribution to trying to resolve these situations. And whereas it could have had an option to be a solid force, has in fact not been. So that's where we got to. So current options. I'm nearly at the end because what are the current options? I said 4. Deal, no deal, general election, referendum. Deal. Could there be a deal which is agreed with the European Union and which would be past the British Parliament? The short answer to that question is no. Boris Johnson claims he's looking for such a deal. He made proposals which united people in the UK Parliament, sorry, not all of them, but the right wing and the DUP that he needed, but the EU has rejected it in the most summary terms. And it's a current thing that's running very strongly. Johnson and Angela Merkel had a long conversation yesterday morning on the phone where Angela Merkel told him in terms that there was no way that the EU would agree to the kind of deal he's proposing. Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach in Ireland, has been saying the same, and all of the key EU leaders have been saying the agreement which you think you can get through the UK Parliament will not agree with our basic positions. We don't want to see the single market and the customs union being broken down and eroded. There's still talk today about the possibility of a deal. I think the chance of it is very, very low indeed. I think the process I described, that lengthy process of not facing up to the real choices, is the chickens coming home to roost at the moment in spades, and I don't think there will be a deal. No deal, going back to the conversation we had earlier. The British Parliament believes it has passed legislation, the Ben Bill, which makes no deal impossible. There are lots of concerns that that may not be right. For example, no deal could happen if at the European Council on the 17th, 18th of this month, the EU does not, by unanimity, vote to extend the deadline. And then we'd simply leave the European Union at that moment with very bad consequences all round. Boris Johnson has continued to say, very publicly, very strongly, his ministers continue to say, that he's got a clever wheeze to avoid the Ben Bill so that we will leave without a deal. Nobody understands what that could be. One thing that was allegedly being tried was trying to get one of the EU member states to veto a further deal along these lines. So the Hungarian foreign minister came to see Boris Johnson last week, and there was a lot of talk and speculation that Mr. Orbán, the Hungarian prime minister, was ready to go against the EU consensus and veto any extension. Personally, I think it's a load of nonsense, and though I'm not a fan of Orbán, the overall EU position has remained very solid through the process. But there's a slight wait and see, because though everybody believes it can't happen, nobody is absolutely confident that it won't happen. And that's why there are nerves and tensions as we get up towards the 31st of October, or more accurately towards the European Council on the 17th and 18th. Next possibility, a general election to change that arithmetic that I described earlier on. Boris Johnson wanted to call a general election. What is required for there to be a general election is that 2/3 of the current House of Commons have to vote for a general election. That's rather simplifying. There are other slightly more complicated processes. But when he put that proposal, all the opposition parties did not vote for a general election, which Boris Johnson was able to say, well, why are you not voting for a general election? You've been calling for a general election for years. Why won't you do it? And the reason was that all those opposition parties were frightened it was a stunt to get rid of this parliament completely before 31st of October. So they said, we will vote for a general election, but only after the deadline has been extended. So in theory on November the 1st, we will vote for a general election. And that's where it stands at the moment. And we'll see what happens. I believe that there is a genuine and ready desire to have a general election by the opposition parties, provided the deadline has been extended beyond 31st of October. But they don't have any confidence in the integrity of Boris Johnson to go down that path at the moment. I'll come in a moment to what might happen in a general election, but I think a general election is likely. The question is whether it will be before Christmas or just after Christmas, and how that will operate. And I'll also talk in a second about what the outcomes of a general election might be. And the fourth option is a referendum. Do we do a rerun of the referendum of 2016? There's lots of people who campaign for that, but there is a lot of worry that that would be seen as illegitimate by the majority who voted to leave in 2016, and would raise quite serious and quite genuine questions about the integrity of the whole process. I myself, and I'll jump to the end, I think the most likely outcome is that we'll have a general election and all the opposition parties will have a manifesto commitment to holding a referendum, and they will get enough in the next parliament so there'll then be a referendum after the general election that will go down the process. If there is a referendum, who will win? Opinion has not moved very substantially towards Remain despite all this stuff, and there's a lot of worry that the election, that if we have a referendum, that actually it wouldn't change anything at the end of the day. Another possibility, though unlikely in my opinion, is that the opposition parties could, without having a general election, put through legislation to get a referendum before a general election. But there isn't sufficient consensus on that question at the moment. So those are the current options. Now, if there is an election, what's going to happen? Boris Johnson, in his Conservative Party conference 2 weeks ago, made the main slogan, "Get Brexit done," because he's correctly identified people in Britain are utterly fed up with this state of affairs, and so get Brexit done. And he wants to put the election as the people, i.e. him, versus Parliament. Parliament, these records, the EU, these records, Angela Merkel, these records, etc. And people versus Parliament to get the will of the people through. But there is a big question about that thesis, which is absolutely deeply believed by Johnson. Is getting Brexit done what people really want, irrespective of outcome? If you start saying we're going to get it down and stay in the European Union, or get it down and leave the European Union, does that solve the get Brexit done problem? And then there's the next issue, what's the salience of Brexit itself? Johnson might discover, this is a phrase in the Times this morning in a journalist, Johnson might, like Theresa May before him, get the Brexit election he wants, only to discover the election becomes about hospital parking charges, ivory sales and fox hunting, i.e. nothing to do with Brexit. And there is a lot of commentary that the way people will vote in a general election has Brexit relatively low on their list of priorities, and taking slightly bigger questions than those, we'll be talking about the health service, the economy, law and order, etc., etc., etc. And so you can't guarantee that if there's a general election from Boris Johnson's point of view, just as Theresa May found in 2017, you can't guarantee that you get the outcome you want, even in terms of people wanting to talk about the subjects you want to talk about. And then finally, in this slide, you have polling volatility. Yesterday, the British election study was published again. It's been a sequence running since 1964. A lot of coverage on it in the British press. And what it emphasised is the massive volatility of the British electorate. In 1964, between 64 and 66 general elections, 13% changed their party of support. In the 2010, 2015, 2017 elections, about 49% of voters backed at least two different parties. There is a massively increased volatility. And so people who assume that there's patterns of voting behaviour that will lead to certain outcomes are not right, because you cannot rely on where people are going to be. It used to be the case that social class determined how you voted. It then became in Britain a case of social tenure. If you lived in rented housing or owner-occupier, that changed. Leave Remain is now a much bigger issue that's come right across, changing people's conventional loyalties and where they are. And so to say there's uncertainty about how an election would go is a very serious understatement. I just thought, I don't know if you can see it clearly enough. This slide is polling by YouGov, which is a respected polling organisation in Britain, answering the question, if there were a general election held tomorrow, which party would you vote for? The horizontal axis starts over here in January 2018, and then changes about April or something like that. And you see a very solid and consistent position. That was Labour just ahead of the Tories, then the other way around, going along roughly, parallel above everything else. Here you had all the minor parties down here, the Greens, the Lib Dems going along. Then suddenly you get to about April, May, and it becomes complete chaos. The whole situation changes. in a completely dramatic way. And the assumptions, I personally think this graph is quite striking, the assumptions of at least some level of consistency in people's voting behaviour and expectations simply is not sustained by the events. So I'll finally put my money on the outcome, which I believe is likely to take place, and this is my last slide. I believe where we are at the moment is that there will be an extension of our EU membership past October the 31st. To when is a good question. I had assumed January 31st, but I now think if there's serious EU people saying we want to take it through to next June 2020, I think there's a serious possibility that that could be the case. So a long extension. Problem about that, if that's what the EU Council says, how will the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson respond? Because for him, and perhaps I haven't made this political point sufficiently, having said we're out, do or die, no deal or deal by October 31st, if we go past October 31st, what then happens? And in particular, his worry is the Brexit party, which is really one man, Nigel Farage, starts to run again on the basis Boris Johnson let you down, the Tories let you down. And in seats up and down the country, parliamentary seats in the general election up and down the country, they will take 25-30% of the Tory vote. And the fear is that's much more likely to happen if it's extended past October the 31st, because the failure of Boris Johnson to get out by October the 31st will be so dramatic. That's why the stakes are so high about this October 31st deadline. Nevertheless, my personal view is it will be extended past October 31st, and that I think will be what happens. I then think there'll be a general election in the way I said. I think the opposition parties will vote for a general election. Boris Johnson will go for a general election. The whole of Boris Johnson's strategy since becoming Prime Minister has been founded on trying to win a general election. He was elected Tory leader because he was thought to be an election winner. I think this is a false view myself, but it's what large numbers of people believe. And so there will be a general election. When will that general election be? I would say early December or February, slightly depending on a bit of toing and froing as to how the timings work out. And I think it will also depend a bit on what extension beyond 31st of October is in fact the case. If it's June, then I can see a February or March general election. What I then think will happen, with my own expectation in the general election, and I'll just flash back to the Parliament. If you had another page on this, the general election 2020 or 2019 column here, where you really have to go back to comparing with the 2017 figure. I think the Tories will be down by about 25 or 30, and I think Labour will be about stable. I think the Lib Dems will be up by about 20, and I think the Scottish Nationalists will be up by about 15. So I think you'll still be in hung Parliament territory, no party having an overall majority. I think Labour, which if it were well led would be in a strong position to form a government, won't be in that position because Corbyn is regarded so weakly, and so they won't make much progress, may even go back. But the important thing is I don't believe that Boris Johnson will succeed in bringing the Tories back to an overall majority in a general election. That may be wishful thinking on my part, but that is my assessment. I'll just finish and then I'll come to you. I'll take questions, but I'm just almost at the end, so I'll finish it and then deal with questions that people have to raise. So my expectation is there'll be a general election, still a hung Parliament, but with a majority in the hung Parliament for another referendum to be held. So I then think there will be another referendum. My optimistic outcome is that the referendum will say stay in the European Union. I think that probably is the case actually, but it will be very nip and tuck as to what actually happens. Where will the state of politics be? The Tory party has been absolutely wiped out by this whole approach. Again, the papers this morning, Boris Johnson had a meeting with the so-called One Nation Tories who are still in the Tory party, not in that 21 who went, pledging that a Tory manifesto for the general election won't be a no-deal manifesto, because the question is, will he say it has to be no deal in a Tory manifesto? And they've all said to him that if it is a no-deal manifesto, then they'll leave the Tory party. And the Tory party will be really in a very divided and difficult place. Where will Labour be? I don't think the split with Corbyn can be long postponed because he is such a pernicious and bad figure. There's some good younger people in the Labour Party, but it's a long way to get them into a stronger position to be able to do anything. I think the Brexit Party will be around, but won't have any seats in Parliament. The Lib Dems will go up a bit, as they always do, but not as big as the 60 or so that they had in 2010. So it's a very messy state of politics, and as a British politician, it almost makes me ashamed to set out this history. Anyway, what I've tried to do is to explain how I think where we are and to give my own versions about where it will be in the future. Thank you very much indeed.